Roberta, can you hear me? Testing. You can hear me? Is it loud enough? I'm good. How are you doing, birthday girl, birth week girl? If anybody else needs a
Okay.
Really the entertainment.
Yeah, here we go. Thank you everybody for coming, and hello to everybody on live stream. It's good to see you. So, Amy Greason is our speaker tonight, and the title of her presentation is Tales from the Jungle: Explorations While Searching for New Medical Treatments. Amy is the founder, executive director, producer, and host of Healing Seekers. She's a graduate of the UNC Chapel Hill School of Pharmacy, and she brings experiences from travels in Belize, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico, Madagascar, Papua New Guinea, and Congo. Her background includes serving as president of the UNC Pharmacy School's American Pharmaceutical Association and being awarded one of the Borough's Welcome Pharmaceutical Company internships in R&D. She also had externships with the Public Health Service, and that led to stints in Anchorage, Alaska, before eventually returning home to North Carolina to join the family business. And then that's where Tony comes in. The family business was in Thomasville, and her father owned the pharmacy in Thomasville, and of course Tony, this is Tony's sister Kathy, and so they grew up in Thomasville. And all I can say about that is, if their maiden name is Scott, if Mama and Papa Scott think the world of and love Amy and her dad, then she's good people. Since then, she's led multiple international expeditions and services as executive director of Healing Seekers and the CEO of Natural Discoveries. Her work in remote biodiverse countries with indigenous people searching for novel medical treatments has attracted interviews with NPR on several occasions, Australian Public Radio, and numerous articles in other press, including the International Policy Digest and in the New York City publication Women Around Town. She has a book. It's called And the Silent Spoke, and that was published in July 2019. Her greatest honor is she was inducted as a fellow in the Explorers Club in New York City. And per Amy, she says it's by far one of the greatest honors of her life. The members of the Explorers Club include the explorers to both poles, to the deepest oceans and to the moon and the outer space. So that includes Sir Edmund Hillary, Charles Lindbergh, Jane Goodall, Sylvia Earle, and Neil Armstrong. As Amy says, they include so many people that I have come to know who truly know no boundaries. Amy lives in High Point with her significant other and their dog Congo. In her free time, she enjoys photography and collecting art, especially the regions she has explored. So, Tony?
I'm having a little trouble hearing, so talk louder than usual.
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't really have much more to add to that, other than Amy has been a dear friend of our family's for many, many years. My parents were customers at the medicine shop that Amy and her dad had in Thomasville. Her dad had that medicine shop for over 30 years. And then Amy joined him after she graduated from pharmacy school. And so they were the two pharmacists. And believe me, you never knew it could be so much fun to go pick up your medications. It was just a blast to go in there. So great folks, great family, very well known in Thomasville and even more well loved. So we're happy to have Amy here tonight.
Thank you. That was one of the nicest introductions I think I've ever had. Thank you. And the love flows both ways. We were great patrons of your parents' place, which was the best and only bakery anywhere around. So even as kids, it was a huge treat on Saturdays to be able to go, and we could pick out one donut, and if we were really good, we could have 2 donuts. So it was a really big thing. There is a snail, and it's called a cone snail, and it's known as the slowest assassin in the world. And it's also been nicknamed the cigarette snail because once it stings or envenomates you, you have just enough time to smoke a cigarette before you die. So what happens is this snail moves very slowly along the ocean floor, and it usually hangs around and it's waiting for a prey, usually a tiny little fish. And when the fish goes by, in a nanosecond, it harpoons this complicated cocktail of about 50 to 100 compounds. Immediately, the fish is paralyzed and it quickly dies. 1 drop of this venom is enough to kill 20 people. And there's a story of this guy in Guam, and he's walking along the shoreline, and he sees these 2 beautiful shells. And he picks them up, and he's showing his girlfriend, and unbeknownst to him, they are cone snails. And unfortunately, they both envenomate him, and he dies. So there's no anti-venom, and without respiratory support, it's fatal. But researchers were intrigued. And so what they did was they started looking at this venom, and they found a class of compounds that they called conopeptides. And there was one in particular, the omega conopeptide. And this one, it had this amazing ability to kill pain. It was over 1,000 times stronger than morphine without the nasty side effects. So they worked on this. They developed it, I believe, up in Canada, and they called it ziconotide. And I believe it's still being studied. I think they got it through some clinical trials and maybe had some side effects that they didn't expect. But they're also looking at other conopeptides for the prevention of nerve cell death. So this could be effective for diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease. And then on the forest floor is a fungus. And I'm sorry to talk about this after we've eaten. It's probably not the best topics. It's not before, and it's not during, so it could be worse, right? But this fungus, when it has an ability or has a chance, it jumps onto an insect and it bores a hole in the exoskeleton. And it goes inside the insect and it slowly starts to devour. But the amazing thing is researchers were like, number one, why isn't this insect able to fight this fungus off? And number two, how's the insect still alive when the fungus continues to grow? It looks like almost like a sci-fi movie, some alien creature by the time this fungus really starts to take hold. And they started looking, and they isolated a compound. And what they discovered was that this compound that was either in the fungus or the fungus excreted somehow lowered the immune system of the insect. So by lowering the immune system of the insect couldn't fight the fungus off, and the fungus just continued to grow. So from that compound, we developed a drug called cyclosporin. If you know anyone who's had an organ transplant, cyclosporin is the reason. It is the reason that organ transplants now are so successful. But if you think of all the species of life on Earth, everything around this beautiful church, your trees and the plants, the insects, the birds, the fish, everything in the ocean and in the rivers, the microbes in the soil. If you had to guess a percentage of the species that we've extensively studied for medicine, would you have a guess? Yeah. I think you're right on. Conservatively, people say less than 5, but I think it's much closer to the 1%. And the kicker is less than 5% of all these species. We have approximately 50% of our pharmaceuticals. Allow me to give you some examples of what they are. They are medications like your statins for cholesterol, Lipitor, Mevacor, Zocor. The original source is the fermentation of rice with yeast. There are drugs like diabetic drugs like metformin, glucophage. Metformin is purported to be the most widely prescribed anti-diabetic in the world. And the source of that is the French lilac plant. And then there's the diabetic drug Byetta. And Byetta comes from the saliva of the Gila monster. So the Gila monster, those huge venomous lizards. Well, researchers looked and they, had this amazing ability to keep their glucose and the insulin levels at a standard level. And they were like, how in the world are they able to do this? They only eat a handful of times a year. And they looked, and in the saliva, they found a hormone, and they called it Exendin-4. And from Exendin-4, we created the drug Byetta. Please, if you're taking Byetta, don't stop taking it. You're not taking the saliva of the Gila monster. I made that mistake by telling a patient one day and had a phone call from the doctor about 2 hours later. So those are all synthetically created now, so that's good. And then there are your blood pressure medicines, like ACE inhibitors. So these are drugs like lisinopril, Prevnar, enalapril, captopril. If you're on a blood pressure medicine that ends in april, chances are it's an ACE inhibitor. And the original source of that, the venomous pit viper, Bothrops gerarica, that's in South America. So this venomous pit viper, when it strikes its prey, it causes a life-threatening plunge in blood pressure. So researchers looked at that. They looked at those compounds in the venom. They isolated it and created the first one, which was captopril. And then in 1920s, farmers in Wisconsin began to panic because their cattle were hemorrhaging. They were bleeding to death, and they could not figure it out. And they finally found the source was a batch of sweet clover. And this particular batch of sweet clover had been stored in overly dry conditions. And those overly dry conditions had facilitated the development of a mold. And that mold produced a chemical that we call dicumarol. And the chemical dicumarol was preventing the blood from clotting. So researchers, again, studied this for a while. And in 1948, they brought a product to market, and they sold it as rat poisoning, and they called it warfarin. Well, it was always thought that it was unfit for human consumption, when in 1951, an Army inductee decided to commit suicide, and he took it, and he lived. And it wasn't long thereafter, they created the pharmaceutical, brought it to market, they called it Coumadin, and most people know that better by its generic name, warfarin. And as the legendary Paul Harvey always used to say, and now you know the rest of the story. Coumadin is the #1 anticoagulant in the world. So I'll mention a few more. Over 80% of our antibiotics, penicillin, cephalosporin, streptomycin, vancomycin, which comes from the forest floors of Borneo, your antiviral Tamiflu. Tamiflu was really big 4 or 5 years ago when the flu came out, everybody, shortage of Tamiflu. That comes from the star anise, it's a Chinese medicine. And then the antivirals, even for AIDS, HIV, the drug AZT was discovered from a sponge found in the Caribbean. Over 70% of the chemo drugs that come from nature are found in tropical areas. So from less than 5%, or better, 1%, of all the species, we have over 50% of our pharmaceuticals. The world has yet to be discovered. When we go on treks and expeditions, there are 3 criteria that we usually follow in choosing a location. The first is we choose those areas that are the most highly biodiverse areas on planet Earth. And these areas, I mean, the amount, the richness and the abundance and the diversity of the species of life are just outrageous. And let me give you an idea of how abundant and diverse. If you take 1/2 acre of land in central North America and you count the number of woody plants, so those plants that are considered woody plants, on average, you're going to find between 20 and 30 different species of woody plants. But if you take that same 1/2 acre of land in western Amazonia, you're going to find over 300 different species of woody plants. So that's just the woody plants. I mean, just imagine this small 1/2 acre of land, and you've got all these life forms in there. Well, there's one thing you can bank on, and that's competition. And it is fierce competition. Talk about survival of the fittest. These species are fighting for water, food, light, space. They're constantly protecting themselves from predators. And plants, you know, if they're threatened, they can't get up and just run away. So many of them in these environments have created chemical arsenals. And they secrete these chemicals when they're threatened, and it will often hurt, harm, or even kill their predators. So one of my favorites is the rosy periwinkle. And we have that, and you know, a lot of people have it in their yards. It's ornamental. It's used all over the world now. But in the native state, it is found naturally in Madagascar. And in Madagascar, it has this ability to secrete these chemicals. Well, the wonderful thing is that these chemicals, we also found, impede certain forms of cancer. And so specifically, like, I guess examples would be acute lymphocytic leukemia, which is a childhood leukemia, and Hodgkin's disease. So from the rosy periwinkle, we discovered compounds that we called vinca alkaloids. And then we created the drugs vincristine and vinblastine, and they're still used today. If you want to know what helped make childhood cancer treatable, it was the rosy periwinkle and the brilliance of the researchers who developed those drugs. So you have these biodiverse places. All these life forms are fighting. They're constantly mutating. They're constantly changing. We're seeing that with COVID. Viruses and bacteria can replicate and mutate so fast we can't even wrap our minds around it. But that is what's going on in these environments too. On top of that, they're hot, humid conditions. There's no cold season. So it's a perfect haven for bacteria, fungi, viruses. If you want to find the best antibiotics, the best antivirals, the best antifungals, you go to these tropical areas where nature and God has already created these chemicals, and you look there to begin with. It's amazing what is there. So the second thing that we look for are those hot spots. And these are areas in the world that are considered the ones that are, I guess, most, it's hard to explain. Well, I guess they're most threatened with habitat loss and destruction. And so these areas are places that maybe are getting logged, mined, and these species are disappearing at very fast rates. And my favorite example, and it's unfortunate I use the word favorite because it's sad, is Madagascar, and this one too. We were first there in 2006, and when we go, we take a film team with us, and we create educational materials. And so I really wanted to do a segment on slash and burn, which is a process where they go through and they burn a swath of forest in order to have the grass to feed their zebu, their cattle. But what happens is it's the beginning of erosion, and because the land is no longer fertile. And so anyway, we're in these off-road SUVs and we're going along, and for 2 days we traveled this trek until we finally saw this land that had been cleared. It's slashed and burned, so there were some charred remnants of trees, and then the soil is red because underneath it's a red soil. And so we stopped and we filmed that, and then fast forward 10 years later, we returned. And we decided to go back to this area again. We hadn't been back in a while. And we're in the SUVs and we're going along. And our team is absolutely shocked because on both sides of the road is nothing but cleared land. And finally, after we've been traveling about 45 minutes, the videographer said, "Guys, look, there's a swath of trees." So it was the complete opposite of what it was before. Before it was lush green rainforest, and now it was just all barren except one little tiny bit, and it was just so sad. But this erosion, when the soil runs out and it's red, it goes into the rivers, and then the rivers flow into the ocean, so it's hurting the coral and all the species in the ocean. And astronauts in space say that when they look down on Madagascar, not always, but sometimes, it looks like Madagascar is bleeding to death because the red soil is coming out. It's just one of those things that our world is changing, and I think our children and grandchildren have a much different world than we can even imagine at this point. The third criteria we do is we look for intact indigenous cultures. These cultures that have been around for hundreds and thousands of years, they have medicine. First thing a tribe does is survival. They've got to survive for infections, number one priority. So every village we go to, the number one medicine they always talk about are, this is what we do to treat infection. This is what we do to treat snake bite. The second thing, interestingly, is about women because procreation. You've got to, have children to sustain the village. These areas are Sometimes when I talk, I start getting off on another thing. I thought, oh, I should tell that story, and then I'm thinking, what am I talking about? But anyway, so the indigenous cultures, and so these people hold the secrets, the wisdom and the knowledge. You know, when I talked about less than 5%, we have all of these pharmaceuticals. Well, the reason is because an indigenous person has shared their knowledge with an outsider. It would be crazy to think about going in and randomly collecting specimens and bringing them back to the laboratory. Your chances of success would be minute. But these tribes have used the same treatments for so long, for generations. Talk about clinical trials, right? You know, if it didn't work, they would have stopped using them a long time ago. So a big basis of the collection that we do is based on tribal use. It's interesting because, you know, as a pharmacist, when I went to school, I wasn't taught any of this. And then people started using a lot of natural medicine back in the 90s, the ginkgo and ginseng, and I thought, you know, I better learn about this because what little I did know, there were some people who were taking things that I knew were interacting with the pharmaceuticals. So I thought, oh, I better educate myself so that I can make sure that they at least check on some things. And then, you know, when I started studying and realizing where all these pharmaceuticals came from, I thought, wow, you know, the divide between the natural and the pharmaceuticals are not that far off in a lot of ways. It would be nice to have a pharmaceutical company that would say, yes, you know, we produce Tamiflu, we bring it out on the market, and by the way, it comes from this plant. I think it would be wonderful to see that. I don't think we'll ever see that, but anyway. The divide is not that far apart. And then in the Pacific Northwest, there's a tree, and it's called the Pacific yew tree. And when loggers would come along and they would log this area, they'd get to a Pacific yew tree and they'd just discard it because it had no commercial value. Well, lo and behold, a couple of researchers, actually from Research Triangle Park, came along when they started studying the tree and the bark was used by indigenous people before a long time. But they started studying this, and what they discovered was in this bark, something was killing breast and ovarian cancer cells unlike anything that they'd seen. So, you know, they started moving forward with it, but they had a problem. In order to treat just the American women with advanced ovarian cancer, it was going to require upwards of 360,000 trees a year. Well, it didn't take long to realize in a matter of weeks that the tree would become extinct. So it became absolutely imperative to take that miracle from nature, merge it with the brilliance of science, and come up with a synthetic drug. It was the only way to get this particular treatment to the people who needed it, and that's what they did. And so they came out with a drug, and it was called Taxol, or paclitaxel. Unfortunately, a good friend of mine was just diagnosed with ovarian cancer last week, and that is going to be one of the drugs that they're going to put her on a protocol. So it's amazing that that is still a very effective treatment today. But the amazing thing is, so we're in Thomasville, right? And we've got 3 or 4 bottles of this on the shelf, and we're dispensing it because it's the newest and greatest thing, and all these women are taking it. And years later, after we've been dispensing it, they realize that it's not just the bark that this compound is coming from that's killing the cancer cells. It is a symbiotic relationship. There's a tiny microbe, a little organism, and together with the bark, together they create that compound that's killing the cancer cells. And I just love that because it's like, you know, so many things in life that, you know, I think some of the greatest things in life are done with teamwork. And it's always been a big lesson, you know, playing sports or whatever, the team sports. I think it's one of the best things that kids can do when they're young. But I think probably the time that really hit me in the face about the teamwork, we were in 2016. We took off on a 2-month trek in the Congo. And for a year, we had planned this trek and lined up. We were going to have 19 porters, trackers, translators, wilderness survival experts. We teamed with Wildlife Conservation Society, used the satellite images because we were going into a territory that was considered uncharted. There was no documentation of what was in there. And our team was so excited. We're like, this is going to be the coolest trek ever because, we're going to see maybe different birds or different animals or trees, truly virgin forest here. And so nothing could have been further from the truth. The day we put our feet on the ground in the Congo, it was one problem after another after another. We were arrested 5 times. We were put in jail twice. And that was when we were on the outside of the jungle. When we were in the jungle, there was thorns and briars, and you fall because, the terrain is so rough, you can't see a lot. But when you would fall, your hands would go down, and they would be on briars and stuff too. And that's if you didn't fall where there were a lot of ants. But the ants were everywhere. Swarms of bees. If we stopped for longer than 10 minutes, 3 bees, 10 bees, 20 bees, 100 bees, 200 bees around us at all times. And we think that was because we were there during the dry season and they were attracted to the moisture because, you're sweating like a pig out there. So we ran out of water, could not find water. We're cutting these small vines, and you could turn the vines up and get a little bit of water, but with the size of the team that we had, there was only so much water. So I made the decision that we would turn it back out and try and exit back out. When you're in the middle of a jungle with a thick canopy, there's no satellite reception. We had backup plans for helicopters, evacuations with global rescue. Satellite phones didn't work. GPS did not work. The trackers kept getting lost because you can't tell where the sun is. There's no, moss that grows on one side of the tree. There's no indication whatsoever which way is north, south, east, or west. And so we finally somehow got out and crossed a logging road and walked another, 4.5 miles before we got to a guard station and were able to call in and get pickups. But, during that time, every member of the team hit a low point. We all thought we would never see our families again. And, I started to question these things, and I started to get mad at God, because I'm thinking, wow, this is my calling in life. I've given everything to make sure that these treks happen, and we're doing everything. And now, I'm not only going to die, but I'm responsible for 18 other lives. And I thought, so I went into this depression that I tried not to show. But, it was only during those points that, in hindsight, you look back and they're the greatest moments in my life. I know that sounds crazy, but when I was writing the book, it took 6 years to write that book. And I went back and I read it for the first time with the editor, and I looked back and I thought, oh my gosh, all the stories, which happen to be some of my favorite stories, were also some of the most challenging times our team has had over the years. And I thought, why didn't you write more about the happy times? Because there were many happy, wonderful times. And I thought, those were the moments that defined who I was. They created the person that I was. And I think that they were more powerful than those, dare say, those more joyful moments when everything is going smooth in the way that you anticipate. But that trek took me a long time to get over. Usually when we get back from a trip, we turn the footage over. We have a post-production team in Greensboro. And within 7 to 10 days, they have all these DVDs. And I just block myself out, and I look at these DVDs, and I'm like, okay, we can create an educational video here, and we need to test that plant for this, and we need to test that plant for that. I could not and would not look at that footage for 6.5 months. Just could not go through that again. But I'll tell you real quick, and Carl, catch me up on time, because I have no idea. 7:25. Okay, great. So the two arrests that we had, the first one, we were in a small village, and it was the last village before we took off in the jungle. And we were flying drones. And they'd never seen drones before. They'd heard of it. And so we're out flying the drones, and all of a sudden, these military guys come out and yell at us and basically scream espionage. They thought we were spying, which I don't know what we could be spying on. But anyway, they were not happy. So they pushed us in the back of a truck with armed guards and hauled us off to this one-room building, and for hours just screamed and yelled at us. And if you've ever seen that show, Locked Up Abroad, on television, it talks about people who've gone abroad and they've gotten arrested, and it's a horrifying experience. They ask for your passports, which is your freedom, and then they talk. You can't understand them. You don't know what's going on. But one of the things is that somehow or another, God was always looking after us. And there are things that happened that no one can explain. So while we're in this jail, the one person that we had befriended in a local restaurant who could speak English heard of our arrest, and her brother was the ambassador to Russia and Ukraine. And one phone call to him, our situation was with the president of the country. And the president of the country came to our aid immediately and got us out, and was actually pretty disturbed that Americans had been treated like that. So we went, they let us go, and we went back to this little village. And about 4 hours later, the village had 2 visitors that they had never had before. 2 Black Hawk helicopters came down in the middle of the village. People had never seen helicopters before. And they stayed. We never had any interactions with them. But we were told, it was 3 days later we left to go into the jungle. They said 2 hours after we left, the Black Hawk helicopters left. So somehow or another, how do you explain that? Other than divine. It was just, the last arrest that we had, that we were in jail, was at the end of the trip. And we had gone through a section of the Congo and ended up on the Sangha River. And the Sangha River comes down, and on the right bank is the Republic of the Congo, which is where we were. And then on the left side is the country of Cameroon. And we'd been out the whole day exploring, having a great time, meeting a lot of the village chiefs. It was just a beautiful day. And it was dark. We got back, and we were pulling up the dugouts up on the shore. And all of a sudden we hear people's voices, which is really unusual because people don't go to the river at dark. And so anyway, we look up, and we all have our headlamps on, and there's about 20 people that are coming towards us. And we're like, oh, what's going on here? And in front of them was their chief of police. And he was angry, and he had this like sawed-off semi-automatic weapon of some sort, and he was raising it up and yelling, and we're asking our translators, what the heck is going on? And nobody could understand. And the guy goes over to our boat driver, who happens to be the only person that is from this village. And the guy walks over to him, and he takes his gun, and he hits the fool out of the back of his head. And the guy goes down on the ground, and we thought, this is not a good situation. They would not allow us to make a call. When we mentioned, we'd like to make a call, they confiscated our satellite phones, got our passports, took everything we had, and for hours went through, similar ordeal, screaming and yelling, except this time they had, the weapon that he was shaking at us. After about 3 or 4 hours of this, they put us in this little side room. And we're all in there, we're like, what are we going to do? Nobody knows we're here. They're going to do something with us, or nobody will ever know where to look to come and find us. And so about 30 minutes later, they came, and we came back out, and the demeanor of the main police guy and his 2 assistants changed dramatically. And after talking, he decided to let us go. And we thought, oh, okay, this is great. What we found out about 3 hours later, our guide and translator had been walking through town, and a gentleman came up to him, and he said, I'm the reason that you all were let go. And he said, well, what do you mean? Get this. This guy had traveled from this village months ago to visit his brother who lived in another village. The village that his brother lived in was about the distance probably between Winston and probably Charleston, South Carolina. They don't have vehicles, so unless he hitched a ride, he was either on, I don't know how he made it, horse or something. So he'd been with his brother in this village, that far away, and the village that his brother lived in was the village we were first arrested. So when he was there when we got arrested, and the whole talk of the town was how these white people got arrested and the president came to their aid. So when he came back that very day to his village and heard that white people had been arrested, he thought, that's got to be the same people. And so he came up and he pleaded with the officer in charge and said, please, don't hurt them or the president will have your job. And they let us go. But it was just amazing, just divine things happen, and sometimes we know about them, and sometimes we don't. But it just never ceases to amaze me how often I think we're all protected, from the person pulling out in front of us in the car, or unfortunately with COVID and everything else, here we are, we're all safe and healthy in a beautiful church. There's just always something to be grateful for. But, really, I've got stories galore, but do you want to open it for questions, or if there are any, or?
And if there aren't questions, we can hear more stories.
Does anybody have a question?
I was wondering, in North Carolina, are there some of these medicinal plants? Traditionally in the mountains, there's lots of people that use traditional plants, and I was wondering if you've discovered any plants from North Carolina.
Great question. About the plants in North Carolina, there are some amazing plants, I guess from the mayapple that we ended up getting the chemo drugs, etoposide and teniposide, I think. I haven't personally studied any of those, actually even in the United States. I started all of this, it was our family pharmacy, and one of the most difficult things in the world was seeing the people that I've known, and I'm gonna try not to get emotional, but I'd known my entire life. And people would come in and they were fighting dreadful things. It seemed like we would give them the best that we could, we meaning, Western society. And then we'd have to, the drugs got stronger, there were more and more drugs, to do and try and make them comfortable and try and do the best we could. But in the process, I saw so many people suffering that I loved dearly. And I knew that so many of these treatments, I guess maybe there was a part of me that thought, okay, America will be taken care of because there's a lot of people here that we can keep looking. But in these remote areas, I was afraid that they were going to be disappearing so quickly. And I actually loved the challenge of going to places that, maybe somebody else hasn't been. But it was a great question, and there's some amazing things right here in our own backyard. And I think that when you combine those strengths of the plants in North Carolina and the U.S. with, those in Indonesia and Africa and everywhere else, we work together as a team, we're going to have some really good things. I still think that after all these years. Yes, ma'am.
Did you run into any difficulties with restrictions to bring out those plants and to use them outside the country?
Great question. So the question was, do we run into any problems with the restrictions of importing the plants? The first time we did this, Madagascar 2006, and we had a team of 6, not including the team on the ground, and we had spent 7 weeks going north Madagascar, down southwest and back up, collected maybe 70 to 80 plants. A large part of them we collected at the end of the trek just because there was such an abundance of plants at that point. Had all the right permits. Takes a while to get them, with the USDA. But anyway, we had the right permits to get them in, right paperwork to take them out. But when they got to customs, I get this call, that dreaded call from U.S. Customs, Amy, a lot of these plants have some moisture. We're going to have to dispose of them. So 2/3 of the plants they had to destroy. So my business partner, about 3 months later, went back with the GPS, retraced the whole trek, and recollected the plants. It was a costly, costly mistake. There are some, though, when we bring them in, some that are on the CITES list. They're endangered, so they're either special permits you have to get to bring those in, or they're not allowed to bring in at all. And we had one plant in 2014, a company in California tested it, and they were a natural products company, and they dealt with the natural enhancement of stem cells. And when they tested this plant, it apparently wasn't a home run, it was a grand slam. It was just amazing. So they wanted the rights to it immediately. So part of the deal was that we worked with them with villages, and we set up 8 villages growing these plants. But the plant, which they knew at the very beginning, was a CITES plant. So they had to work with the government there, with the agricultural department, to closely monitor the crops. And it was really difficult, but they ended up doing it, building a building, hiring a lot of people, production company and stuff. But it was really interesting because two of the villages were really close by. And this was actually an aloe, and it had a stalk with the seeds at the top. And we needed to plant like 500,000 plants. So my business partner, who was a really smart scientist, said, you know, Amy, I'm going to create some kind of almost like pantyhose to put on the top to collect those seeds, because once they disperse, it's almost impossible to get them. I thought, brilliant. So he's working with this village, and they go in and they do this. Well, the plan was to go to the next village the next week, but overnight, well, the next morning, John gets up, and every single one of them has been cut off by the village next door. Some of the elders were walking by and saw these on the top of the plants, and they thought that we were trying to suffocate the spirit of the plant. So they were releasing the spirit of the plant. So the chiefs had to talk to each other and explain what was going on, and then it was not an issue. But yeah, it's always interesting. And then soil, like importing soil is a very special permit. And if you have to have a special laboratory to import wet soil, and that's where so many of our antibiotics and stuff come from. But you know, as long as you abide by the rules and you do everything to a T, customs and the FDA, I mean, everybody's always so kind with that. I think that's the first time anybody's ever asked me that question, so it was a great question.
You may not be able to answer this, and I don't know why, but the place you went, which was so negative against your being there, would one assume that there have not been any white people in that area before?
That's a good question. There was an Australian company there doing a lot of logging, so they were familiar with that. What our guides told us was that we were an opportunity. You know, annual income is so low that, you know, monetary reasons that, you know, if they could make a few bucks off of it is what we were told. But the other people, I mean, I still, about every 3 weeks, email one of the guys there that helped us out. And, you know, there's beautiful people. You just have a few in there that are pretty tough. But this logging company was really amazing because the trees in the Congo, you know, the Amazon has huge trees, but the Congo is unreal. I mean, we were in a section of this trek, and one of the trackers turned around and said something and made everybody stop, and the translator said, he's wanting everybody to just breathe because you're breathing air that's never been touched by a human being before. And I thought, wasn't that beautiful? But these trees, you know, of course, are just huge trees. And the logging company, what they do is they go in and they work with the villages, and the village will elect like 1 or 2 people, maybe 3, and they go with the members of the logging company, and they go in and they tie off the trees that they agree to. So instead of coming through and just cutting everything down, they randomly pick a tree because they say that way it won't disturb the forest, which is absolutely brilliant. But we were going, in Papua New Guinea, we were going back to an area that we were, gosh, I guess about 3 years out, and wanted to go back to this one area. And there you hire missionary pilots, only pilots that fly to some of these places, and they're wonderful. So the morning that we were supposed to fly, no, I take it back. The night before we were supposed to fly, this missionary pilot calls and says, Amy, we can't fly out. I said, what do you mean? He said, tribal warfare. So the two tribes are fighting. He said, we can't even land. He said, it's just too dangerous. The fighting's going on right there. I said, yeah, no problem or whatever. But what happened is about a year prior, a logging company came in, I think from China, and what they did was they went into this village and they said, we want to buy your land. And, I'm making this up, but I think in my mind it was like maybe $10 for a certain amount of land. I mean, cheap for us, but a lot of money for them. And so people quickly sold their land. But then when the money ran out and then their land was gone, they got mad. And so they started fighting the members of the logging company. I mean, gunfire, spears, machetes, everything was out. Then they started to go to their neighbors. And they'd always had a peaceful arrangement. But they fought their neighbors for the land. And so these two tribes were fighting. So the police guy who was in charge of this area had his officers there, but members on both sides didn't respect the authorities. And his officers were in harm's way. So what he did was he pulled all his officers out and told them, go at it. I'm not going to lose a life of my officer. This is your problem, you deal with it. And when it gets back, so the women and the children fled, and the men fought it out. And I don't know how long that went on, but it was pretty amazing strategy in a lot of ways, not to put his own men in there. But so those kind of things, I think, happen that we don't really think about in our country so much, those precious things like land. Of course, water is probably going to be something that at one point the world is going to be desperate for. All right, great. Thank you. Yes. Sure.
This is, back on the origin of drugs. I thought there's origin like Coumadin, which I take, Coumadin. I was wondering if any of the neurological drugs, especially like for epilepsy, which, they don't know, they know they work, but they don't know how they work, that affect, electrical activity in the brain. Are any of them from no sources in nature?
Gosh, you have just, I don't remember. Like Dilantin and phenobarb, I don't remember. Not anything that comes to mind. I know that those kind of drugs that have what we, like a narrow therapeutic index, meaning that dose has got to be so precise every single time, are very difficult to, I don't know. I'm rambling because I can't think of a one that I know a natural origin to. Yeah, it's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We thank you. What a blessing. So glad you were here with us. Thank you so much. The adventures next week, we'll hear about St. Philip's. Thank you all and have a good evening.